I would like to welcome all of you out there attending this Fringe meeting. It's good to know that even in such trying times, women can come together to consider the issues that matter to us. Before we start, I'll just run through some housekeeping. As an attendee, you can decide if you want your camera on or not. We also ask you to mute yourself at all times, as this prevents feedback. Select speaker view if you want to see the speaker at all times. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat box and send them to panel questions. If you have IT queries, you can put them in the chat box on your screen. Queries should be directed to the technical support. The session will finish no later than 7 p.m. Captions are also available. You just need to click the box in the control panel that has CC below it and select Show Subtitle to view them. We have 2 speakers on our panel today. I'll ask each of them to speak for a few minutes, and when they're finished, we'll take questions. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Gloria Mills, who will be talking about actions women will... I managed to do something to my computer then. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Gloria Mills, who will be talking about actions women will expect to close the workplace inequality gaps, and Abena Oppong-Asare, who will be talking about how Labour will close the gender gaps. Our first speaker is Gloria Mills, who is Unison's National Secretary for Equalities. Over to you, Gloria.
Okay, thank you, Sian, and thank you to everyone on the call. I want to say thank you, Sian, for the excellent work you've done for Unison and continue to do, particularly in fighting to ensure that the voices of women, low-paid women, and women working in the care sector are heard loud and clear. And I think it's really important that we pay tribute to all of our frontline workers working in all areas of public services, but also in the private sector, who have been putting their lives and livelihoods at risk in terms of dealing with COVID, because COVID-19 has exposed huge inequalities in the world of work. Huge gaps in inequalities have been made worse. We've had gaps in inequalities that were entrenched for years and for decades before COVID, but has now taken on a new importance and significance in the workplace. And unless we take urgent action to close those gaps now, they're likely to become more embedded and long-lasting. And moreover, it will take years to undo the hard-won progress we have made. And I want to start, first of all, by thanking all my Unison colleagues, sisters and brothers and everyone for the excellent work you have been doing, because you have put equality at the heart of everything we do in the trade union movement, everything we do at Unison, and also what we do in the Labour Party. And it has been very important because not only are we fighting for equality at work, we are fighting for it at home, and we are fighting for it in society. And we are fighting for equality in all of its diversity. And I think it's really important that I stress that. We are fighting for LGBT+ rights, we are fighting for rights for younger workers, for older women and older workers. And we are fighting for rights for younger workers, for people who are retired, our members who are receiving a pension. And we are fighting for disabled workers, we are fighting for women, we are fighting for Black workers. And it's really important that we have been campaigning tirelessly to get a new deal for working people, and also to make sure that they have access to opportunities, equal opportunities, but also access to equity in terms of outcomes. And to spearhead these campaigns, you know, we have increased our membership because it's because of high trade union numbers and collective bargaining power, that we can approach inequality disputes from a position of strength. So we are holding the employers, we are holding the government to account, and we are holding them to account in different ways. And in a number of areas, we are winning. But, you know, we have to ratchet up the industrial action, the strikes, the legal battles in the highest court in the land in order for us to achieve these gains. And when we do, we expect and we would hope that the Labour Party would support us in doing so. But more importantly, that, you know, we will get a Labour government who will help us to deal with all of the restrictions and impositions we have seen in terms of trade union organizing. So it's very important that, you know, we continue to have victories in the highest court in this country, but we also need to ensure that we remold the political landscape to make it fairer. Because if the government is talking about building back better, we have to ensure that in politics they build back fairer. And I want to say two things about this government agenda in terms of building back better and leveling up. We must not lose sight of the fact that this government and the Tories in general over the last 4 decades from 1979, they have had agenda of leveling down. So, you know, their compulsory competitive tendering, outsourcing jobs to the private sector have been based around putting women's jobs out to the lowest bidder. So we need to, so we need to ensure that people do not buy the rhetoric of, you know, leveling up. They have leveled down to the lowest common denominator. In fact, we are at rock bottom now and there's nowhere left to go. So don't believe the rhetoric, because their record tells a different story, and their record does not have the substance that supports building back better or leveling up. So we need to ensure that we get a Labour government, and we do that by encouraging our members to become members of our Labour link. Because if we have the strength in numbers, then we can ensure that Labour is able to match some of the donations the Conservative receive from their wealthy business owners who bankroll them. And we've seen what that has been, we see what has been going on with the cronyism, the contracts that are not being done in a fair and transparent manner. So I want to say we've seen a decade of Tory austerity, which has been made worse by the pandemic. And what we must ensure now is that unions develop with Labour a progressive agenda to rebuild the UK economic resilience, to deliver sustainable growth, and to reduce socio-economic inequalities. And as part of that New Deal for working people, we must see huge investment in public services and in manufacturing and in the green jobs and the digital jobs, where we must ensure that there is a 50% guaranteed representation for women and young girls to be able to get into these new sectors. And we also need to close the gender gap, the gender pay gap. There are so many gaps that we need to close, but the gender pay gap remains one of the biggest gaps we need to close, and we need to campaign to ensure that the gender pay reporting comes back into effect in the autumn, and that we end the pause in terms of the gender pay gap. And we need to close the ethnicity and racial pay gaps as well. Those are the gaps we want to close, the disability gaps, but also the pension gap. The pension gap at the moment, it's over 30%, the gender pension gap, it's over 30%. So we need to ensure that those gaps are closed. But I also want to say that, we've had the representation gap is also a power gap. And we need to ensure that the representation gap is closed at all levels in terms of our politics. And I want to say it's really good. The news is good for Labour because at the 2019 general election, we had 104 women MPs out of the 202 members of parliament. For the first time in Labour history, this has happened. We have 51% of Labour MPs are women. And that's thanks to the excellent work that women in the Labour Party have been doing with the all-women shortlist, but also the work of that people like Abena has been doing and standing for elected office. Because, we need power. And to close the power gap, we need to have power with a purpose. So it's really important. And you can check the House of Commons library to see the progress that we have made. And we have made some progress recently in terms of the directly elected mayors, because out of the 19 Labour directly elected mayors, we now have 5 who are women. And that's a really good sign of progress. But we need to close the gaps in areas like our CLPs and in our local councils. And one of the things we must do is to end the segregation in terms of the roles that we have in terms of leadership position that opens up from a local level. And people might not realize this, but there are certain jobs that propel men into leadership positions. They go for the strategic roles of finance and regeneration. They allocate roles to women in terms of social care and education. There's nothing wrong in social care and education, but we must ensure that those jobs and those roles have the same value and that they're given the same importance, because if you are responsible as a cabinet member for education or social care, you should also be able to become the leader of the council if you do those jobs. So we want to ensure that those bias, whether they're conscious or unconscious bias, are actually removed, but also we remove the barriers to representation and participation in terms of councillors with caring responsibility, MPs with caring responsibility, making it easier for women to stand and to make a difference, because it's by having a critical mass we will be able to make a difference. So I'm asking for Labour to publish an audit of where women and diverse representation and diverse groups are within the party in terms of the devolved administration, MPs, MSPs, councillors, council leaders, CLPs, and within the region. I think that's really important for us to map and monitor the kind of progress we are making, because we need to have the right leadership, people who are going to make the right decision, that puts care, that puts flexible working, that puts our ethical care charter, that puts the living wage at the heart of the decisions that they're making. And that starts at local level if we are going to be able to improve the quality of life in the workplace. So we need to look at the economic impact, and what so when the restrictions are lifted, what it actually means for the economy and for people's lives, because lifting the restriction does not end the discrimination that women are facing in all of their diversity. And one of the areas we must start is in terms of the long COVID and the post-COVID syndrome. It's having a huge impact on frontline workers' lives, because they're experiencing, over 79% of them have said that they experienced long COVID and that it was caught in the workplace. And we need to have long COVID recognized as a disability, but also recognized for personal injury, so that people have the right support. So, because at the moment, what we are seeing are people being forced out of the workplace. So all I want to say is thanks to all of my colleagues, to Josie, to Bookie, to all of the equality team, for the work, and my labeling colleagues, Mark Ferguson and his team, for organizing this fringe meeting. We will have an opportunity to answer any questions that you may have, but we need a new social contract. And now we have a critical mass of Labour MPs. We want to ensure that they force the pace of change, that they step up, that they stand up, and they deliver a new agenda for women and for equality that close all of the gender gaps. Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria. I'm now going to ask Abena Oppong-Asare MP, who is the shadow, just as I start, it goes blank, Shadow Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury and Chair of the Labour Party Women's Network, to speak. Over to you, Abena. And I am sorry if I've mangled your name.
That's okay. Hi, everybody. Good to see you. So my name is Abena Oppong-Asare. As mentioned, I'm the MP for Erith and Thamesmead. I want to thank you for inviting me to speak at this excellent event in advance of Labour conference. And I just want to say, I also want to begin by paying tribute to Unison and Unison members for all the hard work you've done over the year. I am a Unison member as well, as a lot of you know. I also want to pay particular thanks to Unison women who are working on frontline in the pandemic response in the health and care sector and in local government and in our central services. I know that this has been a really difficult time for a lot of you, particularly as a lot of you have been working on frontline services, particularly as a lot of individuals that do work on frontline services, and I don't need to, I'm sure I'm quoting what you already know, which is that most of it is women, and many of them Unison members, and I just think you guys are the true heroes of the COVID crisis, so thank you again. I just want to say, I hope that the work you've done is a turning point where we begin to recognise the real value of work in our society. It's an issue that I've consistently raised in Parliament. I know that many of you have faced numerous challenges over the last year, caring for children and family members, and also perhaps working from home while juggling other responsibilities. And particularly, these challenges have intensified in terms of the last year, particularly for women and broadly. So I'm just going to go back to the theme of today's discussion, which is how would Labour close the gender gap? And it's so good to go after Gloria Mills, because she just hit the nail on the head about what the issues are and what should be looked into. As we all know, women's role in our economy has changed dramatically over the last years, over the last generation, from a situation in the 1970s where just half of women aged 25 to 54 were in paid employment, to one where it's almost 4 in 5 of us. Trade unions such as Unison have been actually playing a key role in empowering women in the workplace and securing the rights and pay we deserve. And I know this, having been a Unison trade union rep in the workplace when I worked at the GLA. So there has been real progress, but as mentioned by Gloria, there is still much more work to do. You know, during the COVID crisis, working women entered the COVID crisis in a much more vulnerable position than men. I've been doing some work on this in my constituency, so I asked the Women's Budget Group to carry out an analysis in my constituency last year. So I did a report, Leaving No One Behind in Erith and Thamesmead, which looked at women, it looked at disability, low socioeconomic Black and Asian minority ethnic, and young people. And from those stats, we saw that women were most likely to be low paid and insecure work. We've seen of those that were in paid work prior to lockdown, which was mothers, were 47%. My constituency more likely than fathers to have permanently lost their job or quit, and they were 14% more likely to be furloughed. Of course, there isn't a clear picture, as we know the crisis has affected different groups of women in different ways. But I'll say that the financial difficulties of COVID-19 have especially hit disabled women, and so like a local disability in my organisation, in my area, told me that many disabled women have reported rising costs in relation to work, whilst access to transport have also been made difficult. Then there's also young women who are overrepresented in sectors that have been hardest hit by the lockdown, so such as accommodation, food and retail, and 36% of all young female workers compared to just 35% of men. And also to add to this, and I'm not trying to depress you, I just want to kind of just talk about the reality of the situation, which is that the crisis has had such a brutal impact on working parents who've been working harder than men. We've seen that the IFS has said that mothers are 1.5 times more likely than fathers to have lost their job or quit since lockdown begun. I have repeatedly been contacted by women in my constituency who are worried that they have to choose between their jobs and looking after their children. And I just also want to say the level of unpaid care work by women has increased during the pandemic substantially. There was a study that showed that a proportion of mothers responsible for 90 to 100% childcare basically increased from 27% to 45% during lockdown. I just also wanted to go back to what Gloria said about the gender pay gap. So as we've seen before the pandemic, there were a number of huge challenges. So one of those was the gender pay gap, which still stands at around 15%. And in recent years, we've seen past progress slow considerably. In the years between 2002 and 2010, the gender gap narrowed by over 7%, but that decade since the Conservatives have taken office, that the progress has stalled and the pay inequality has just fallen by just 2.4%. 2.4%. This government's been in power for about 11 years now, so we haven't really seen much progress. Another thing is also that pay equality is not expected to be achieved until 2052, and the way that things are working at the current pace of change, that means that women in their mid-30s will never ever know equal pay in their working lives. So one of the things that we've done as a party is like Labour, Unison, has called for a number of immediate measures to begin to change this, because we don't think it's good enough that the government have suspended reporting on the gender pay gap, because during the pandemic, it's made tackling this more, not less urgent. And as I've just quoted, that's the reason why I quoted those stats, particularly across my constituency in terms of the type of cases and the stuff from the Women's Budget Group. We know the situation is getting a lot worse. And so the fact that the government is suspending reporting just shows that it's not really high on their radar. And just to give you a bit of a picture, recent figures show that 3/4 of companies missed the initial deadline to report their gender pay gap this year. One thing is that the government needs to do more to ensure that vital reporting is completed by every country for us to really kind of address this gender pay gap. We also need to modernise equal pay legislation so that women have the right to know what their male colleague is doing the same work as them, and so that they're paid equally. And one of the things that we're also calling for as a party, the Labour Party is also calling for, is the government should also publish a review of the economic impact of COVID on women and make tackling structural inequalities as a priority in the forthcoming spending review. It's a number of, these are issues that we raised quite substantially in Parliament, particularly when we've seen decisions being made by the government, as you probably remember, in terms of like lockdown measures. It took quite some time before beauty parlours and places opened, whereas there were other sectors the government quickly look at opening, and it just meant that women, areas where they were dominated by women, were just constantly being overlooked. I want to also turn to the issues of the rights of work, which is a really big issue. Too many women continue to face discrimination in the workplace, and of course, pregnant women and new mothers often. This is something that I've seen through my cases. I've seen it through the experiences that quite a number of my friends have had, the way they've been discriminated. And I just want to say that one of my colleagues, my brilliant colleagues actually, the Shadow Secretary of State for Women and Equalities, Marsha Takoba, recently, you may have seen it, she recently set out Labour's plans to make it illegal to make a new mother redundant during pregnancy and maternity leave. I mean, we think this is literally just a no-brainer. The sad reality is, you do actually need this set in legislation to make sure that, organisations and companies don't actually, just make people redundant during pregnancy or maternity leave. It forms part of a series of policies that Labour's doing, which is to protect and promote gender equality in the recovery from the pandemic. We have also called the government to make it illegal to make a new mother redundant from notification of pregnancy until 6 months after they return to work, except in specific circumstances, and they really do need to be specific. Finally, I just want to say something about flexible working. Over the pandemic, we've seen the advantages and challenges of flexible way of working. And I think that flexibility in working arrangements can play a vital role in enabling women to rejoin or remain in employment. And that is something that, as a party, the Labour Party, we have called for legislation to be introduced to essentially enshrine workers' rights to flexible and remote working. And we feel that this is something that will benefit millions of women. But one thing I just want to say, as we come out of this crisis, we also need to make sure flexible working is not used to take advantage of workers, because there is the bad and good side of it. So we need to make sure that flexibility suits the employee, get that right, not the employer. And in particular, we need to make sure that it does work for women. So that's something that we think that needs to be considered really carefully. My colleague, Andy MacDonald, has also warned about the one-sided flexibility for employers. Unless legislation is introduced to update employment rights and protections in line with the changing world of work. I know that trade unions such as Unison will also play a vital role in ensuring that happens. I just wanted to conclude by saying, I hope I've given you an idea of what Labour in Power would do to close the gender pay gap. So we want to secure better rights for women's workers and end exploitation for everyone in the workplace. I mean, this is something that I'm also really passionate about, having looked at gender equality for quite a substantial amount of years. And, of course, there are many things we must do to, which is like repairing a broken safety net, so it's once again fit for purpose. We know that over 80% of the impacts of cuts to social security during the last decade fell on women. We need to have a childcare system that reflects the working patterns of the 21st century parents. And it's not just for mothers, and supports them also to make sure that they have decent and meaningful work. And also, I think most importantly, valuing women properly for the work they do. You know, the stats from the TUC estimates that 2.6 million female key workers get less than £10 an hour, which is utterly ridiculous. I have repeatedly asked the government to do something about this. I've also raised this with the Chancellor, particularly when he did this autumn statement about how the fact there was nothing in there about providing support to public workers. It just seems to be falling on deaf ears with the Conservatives, which is deeply concerning. Of course, you know, it's really, really tough. You know, we're in opposition and we're trying to do the best that we can do, but we can't do this alone. And so I look forward to working with Unison, basically to take this vital mission, or shall I say this fight forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Abena. Right, I'm now going to open the discussion up for questions from the audience. Can you please put your questions into the chat? We have received some questions from you in advance, so we'll do those first. So the first one is, how can we ensure ordinary working women are involved in Labour's plans for recovery? And I'm opening it up to both of you. Gloria, Abena, either of you?
Do you want to, shall I go first?
Do you want me to give you another one, or do you want to carry on with that one? Right.
We take it in, is it okay? Should we take it in sets of threes? Or?
Yeah, okay then. The second one is there anything that can be done to get the gender pay equality before 2052? What can be done to make the government listen? I'm sorry, I shouldn't laugh at, you know. How can we challenge the Conservative government on low pay and valuing women's work, not just equal pay?
Okay. Yeah. Okay, shall I have a go?
Yeah, great. Yeah. Thank you.
So challenging I'm going to take the last two questions together, which is challenge the government on low pay and getting the government to listen on the gender pay gap by 2052. The reality is we have consistently, as a Labour party in Parliament, constantly been making representations to the government on this. They don't get it. And my personal view is we do need a Labour government to be able to implement this. You know, I quoted the alarming stats to you about the gender pay gap in terms of the reporting, how little has been done on this. A lot of these issues existed way before the pandemic. This government has been in power for 11 years. And the reality is we're moving backwards and not forwards. So I do feel that we do need a Labour government to be able to reverse this. That's the reality. In terms of opposition, we are raising this. We are working with organisations, various women's charities, essentially to hold the government to account on this. But, you know, they have the numbers. In terms of making sure that working women are involved in the recovery, I think that's really important. So when I did my analysis, my report in my constituency, I did involve women locally in my community, as well as working with charities and organisations such as the Women's Budget Group and also the Fawcett Society. So it is something that I think is really important, because how can we make sure that your voices are reflected properly in Parliament if we don't do that? So I don't know if you've seen, whenever I'm advocating, I always try to use case studies or conversations from actual working women to really highlight their experiences, because I think also it makes a strong impact, particularly in terms of holding this atrocious government to account, because they can't really argue the stories behind what we're trying to say, particularly when it comes to the recovery. And then there's also a Women's Inequalities committee as well in Parliament. I don't sit on that. You know, there's opportunities. I know they did a review recently looking at how COVID impacted women, and so that was an opportunity for people from various sectors to feed into that. But yeah, forums like this are important. And I know that Marsha's been doing, my colleague Marsha, who's the Shadow Minister for Women Equalities, is doing a lot of engagement with individuals on the ground on that aspect. So I'm going to stop here, otherwise, wait, I keep talking, so I'm going to stop.
Okay. Oh, should I come in now, Sian? Okay. Well, I just
Sorry,
want
yes,
to...
please, Gloria.
Sorry, yeah, thanks. Well, in terms of the question, what can be done to make the government listen in terms of equal pay? I really think that, you know, we really need the Equality and Human Rights Commission to step up. I think they have the ability to bring class action claims. We did ensure that that happened. We wanted the 2006 legislation when Labour was in government to be extended to trade unions to be able to bring these super class action cases. And, you know, it was said that, you know, all we needed to do was to get the Equality and Human Rights Commission to do it, because it was put into their hands and they had the power to do it. And I think we're not going to have to wait, and we should not be waiting until 2052. We should be pressuring now for that super class action case to expedite the gender pay reporting, but also to expedite closing the gender pay gap, because they have the power to do it. And, you know, it's no good getting powers if you're not going to use it to change the position of women. And I think that's really important. And I think we should also link that in to the campaign that Unison is running with other organizations as well, to ensure that CEDAW is part of the UK legislation and is incorporated into UK domestic law, because that's how you get transformative and substantive equality. And, you know, women are being taken advantage of. It's this nonsense of being made promises after promises that, you know, no one is going to deliver on. And we have got to call time on empty promises and say, no, we expect action to be taken, and we need substantive action. And the one in terms of how can we ensure ordinary working women become part of the post-recovery plan, I think we really do need Labour to start doing a Labour Listens and engagement programme across all of the regions of the UK. We have huge geographical and regional disparities, and it's important that Labour listens to ordinary women. The voices of ordinary women should be shaping the policies for Labour for the next government. So I think it's really important to build on women's lived experiences and for them to shape and impact the policies, because that's what we did in terms of Labour coming into government in 1997. And we really do need to do that. The party is too distant from the people who should be shaping its policies, you know, and I hope that Labour in their locality would get closer to the lived experiences of the people in those communities, so that the agenda reflects what people are saying. It's no good having an agenda that is highfalutin and doesn't respect what people are saying. Politics is about responding and being ahead of where people want you to be in saying what their experiences are. You may not like it, but I've always taken it on the chin. I don't want people to tell me what I want to hear. I want them to tell me how they're really feeling so that we could respond to their genuine concerns rather than, try to palm them off with, fluff that does not work. So all I'm saying is get real. Let's look at the reality of people's lives and not the rhetoric of thinking of what people's lives are about. So I've said it all the time, and I will continue to say it, and I say it all the time in the Labour Party. It's the real voices of women's lived experiences that we need to shape the policies for the next election. Thanks.
Thank you, Gloria. We've got some questions coming into the chat box now, so bear with me. I'm multitasking now. How can we this is from Joe Walton. How can we ensure that women are not forced out of work through unpaid caring duties? And she's got a second part to it. Is Labour going to support a well-paid and resourced national care service? Then we've got a question for Anushka Davis. How can women be fast-tracked to leadership positions so that decisions around recovery and inclusion of women in green and technological jobs will be high on the agenda? Right. And the third one, bear with me because every question comes up 3 times. This is: the Tory government has suspended all diversity and inclusion work across the civil service, which is indicative of their lack of commitment. How can we challenge this? And I can't see who's sent that one at the moment. So if you could answer those 3.
It's the first one. How can we ensure that women are not forced out of the labour market because of, sorry, I'm trying to see if I could find it in the chat. Is it there?
Yeah. Unpaid caring duties.
Okay, yes. I would. Sorry.
Do you mind saying the questions again?
Yeah, certainly. Give me a chance.
I've seen it now in the chat. Thanks.
Sorry. How can we ensure that women are not forced out of the workplace through unpaid caring duties? And then the second part of that question is Labour going to support a well-paid and resourced national care service? And then, how can women be fast-tracked to leadership positions so that decisions around recovery and inclusion of women in green and technological jobs will be high on the agenda? And the third one is: the Tory government has suspended all diversity and inclusion work across the civil service, which is indicative of their lack of commitment. How can we challenge this? Gloria, do you want to go first this time?
Yeah, I'll go first. Yeah,
your mic's
no
on.
problem at all. I think in terms of, just to say, I think in terms of women being forced out because of unpaid care work, I think we need to have a new model in terms of care. I think that we should have a system where there is an agreed rate for people who are having to care. And also what happens is we need to ensure that women are given specific protection for caring responsibilities. And that means that it should be part of care is a human right issue and it's an equality issue, and it should be seen in that context. And I would hope that Labour would have a look at how it extend the protection to ensure that it's possible to combine care and responsibility and working as well without being forced out of the labor market and being forced out and being forced into poverty. So I think it's really critical that Labour does that. And in terms of the National Care Service, I think we should go back to the model of 1948, where, you know, Labour had a vision. You know, we need people in leadership who have vision. You know, we need the Nye Bevans of this world. You know, people, you know, my hero, I would, you know, everywhere, you know, people who have a vision that says that, you know, today must be different and tomorrow must be better. You know, we have to aim to be better tomorrow. And, you know, the vision of the NHS was, you know, he said the poor man and the rich man should go through the same door in terms of the NHS. The poor man's lack of wealth must never be a disadvantage, and the rich man's wealth must never be an advantage. So we fund it through general taxation and free at the point of need. Now, we need some Labour visionaries to come up with a model, because we had the 1948 National Assistance Model, which provided care homes in every local authority for the elderly, free at the point of need. And we need a system that gets back to that. And that means we have to reorganize social care. And we have to take the market out of care. We have to take the profit motive out of care. You know, that's what Nye Bevan did. He went to America. He saw the social insurance system and he rejected that, because he said that's a profit market oriented model that he did not want for the British people. You know, ability to pay must never come into any provision where you have to respect human dignity and human life. And I think that's a very good starting point for us. And the second point, in terms of fast tracking into leadership, you know, we have the equality laws on the statute book that allows us to have positive action measures where we have gaps in leadership, and we can use that to fast track by training people up, giving them the skills to be able to compete. There are some areas where there are exceptions in terms of disability, and others where you can actually have positive discrimination for underrepresented group. But there are also huge areas of positive action that is not being utilized. And I think Labour should relook at the 2010 Equality Act, because Harriet Harman included all of those provisions in the law, and we need to see how we can use it in terms of fast tracking women into leadership. And in terms of the Tory government and suspending equality, I mean, there's so many areas, you know, where we could, you know, try and hold them to account. There are provisions in the Equality Act as well, which gives them specific legal responsibilities and obligations in terms of the public sector equality duty, in terms of equality analysis. And I think we really we need to have more parliamentary questions that are targeted, that are specific, that hold them to account, and would have those the evidence that's needed for us to be able to, you know, to take those judicial review and to hold them to account in the court of law where they're suspending their obligations. You don't sign international treaties if you are not going to abide by it. And we need to make sure that they abide by all of the international treaties that they've signed and they've ratified. Thanks.
Thank you. Abena, would you like to answer those questions?
Yeah, so the question on the green jobs being high on the agenda. So this is something that as a party and me as an individual have been quite vocal about, particularly the fact that the government has been going on specifically about the green recovery. This could be a turning point for the green economy and the environment. And it's really important that women's issues shouldn't be undermined by the fact that there is a rush to create low-paid insecure, and also in some circumstances environmentally harmful jobs. Want to get the government to a starting position where women's role in the economy is linked very strongly with the green recovery, particularly in areas such as investment in sectors such as social care, and so that is more beneficial in what I say is a gender balanced economy, and also to the environment where we're creating jobs in construction. I also wanted to, and I hate to say it, Boris's build, build, build should really focus on the sector that will benefit the country most and are responsible in terms of like planet and gender equality. The Women's Budget Group have actually done some research on this as well, where and this links in, I think, with the next question on the National Care Service, where they found that 2% of GDP investment in care creates double the number of jobs for women and almost as many men than in the same investment in construction. So it shows that there's much more work to be done on that aspect. In terms of whether Labour's going to support a national care service, I have to be honest, you're asking me to announce something on behalf of the Labour Party that isn't actually within my remit, and I don't actually have the authority to do that because this is not my portfolio. So I mean, I'll get into trouble essentially on that aspect, but it is something that will feed back to my colleague Jonathan Ashworth, and also Marsha Dakoba, who is a shadow Women's for Equalities on that aspect in terms of that area, because I have to be honest, this isn't my area of expertise on Labour's policy aspect on that. I think there was another question, particularly on Labour. Is it fast tracking? My handwriting's so bad. To leadership positions. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So I think that this is from, I'm going to talk about it from the perspective of the work that I do for the Labour Women's Network. And I hope I'm asking the question in the right way. Apologies if not. I think, as Gloria mentioned, it's great we've got more women in Parliament, got more than the Tories. My thing is about maintaining those women in those positions, and also making sure that they have senior responsibilities within the Labour Party. And it's not just for me, it's not just about Parliament. It's also about making sure we have women in leadership positions at a council level, and also making sure we have leadership position as advisors, particularly in terms of helping making policy decisions. Through my role on the Labour Women's Network, we have consistently been doing work and trying to get more women into public office, but more women into leadership positions. And we have called it out when we felt that it hasn't been taken really seriously. We literally can't take our eye off the ball, even though that we've got more women in Parliament, because if you do that, it can easily change. And it's also, as well as fast tracking women into leadership positions, I also want to talk about the fact that we also need to look at the ugly side of getting active in particularly in politics, if that's what you're talking about, which is the fact that it can be extremely toxic, the rise of misogyny and racist abuse. And that is something that I don't think is really kind of addressed in our training now. One of the things that we have to do is train women to be resilient, and also to practice self-care, because it has got massively out of hand. And I think that is something that really, needs to be addressed. You know, the online harms bill that's coming through Parliament could have been doing much more to address online abuse as well. Apologies if I'm going off point, but I think that covers the question. And have I missed any other questions, Sian?
No, I think you've answered those. We've got time for maybe one more. I will sort of, it's a statement in the chat, and because I'm Welsh and I'm covered by a Welsh Labour government, I'm going to read it out. Please, and it's from Jane Gebby, and it says, pleased that Welsh Labour are going to write CEDAW into domestic legislation. So that is good for women anyway. Then we have a question. Is Labour going to support all women, as many involved involved in unpaid work such as child benefits and making childcare affordable for working mothers? And there was another one. Liz Hines asked, data shows that the gender pay gap is wider for self-employed. What can be done to close this gap? And other than that, it's just another statement saying there only 3 of the CEOs in the FTSE 100 are women.
Can I just come in, Sian, just to say well done, and thanks to Jane and to Welsh Labour government for their commitment to write CEDAW into domestic legislation. So thank you to all the Welsh Labour women and all the progressive work that you are doing. It's really important. In terms of childcare, I should say, Labour had a national childcare strategy, and we also introduced the working families and the working childcare tax credit, all these different forms of tax credits. But because of the fact that we have a market in that area, the more you put into childcare, the more women are required to put it. In fact, in a number of cases, families are spending more on childcare than they spend on a mortgage in some areas. So I think what we need to do, we need to go back to the fact that we had Show Start centres provided, over 3,000 we had provided by local authorities. So we need to have a new partnership with local authorities that would make it more accessible, more affordable, and better quality. But we don't have the market. We have to remove the profit motive and the market in all of these areas. And until Labour realize that the market has become such a toxic issue, in terms of, having there's no level playing field, then I think what we would be having is more and more people with a profit motive coming into these areas in the public services and stripping all of the profits out, rather than providing public services. Public services are the greatest level of equality. And if we are going to level up in terms of inequality, we must invest in public services to make them accessible and affordable to everyone. Thanks.
Thank you, Gloria. Abena, you've got two minutes. Sorry to put you under pressure.
Yes. So yeah, okay. So I think there was a question about self-employed, about women. This is something that actually I've been looking at quite substantially, in terms of not just women, but also self-employed, but also I do know it impacts women and Black and Asian minority ethnics as well. And also there are other schemes as well that I'm concerned about, that I've actually just asked the government questions on this, because we don't actually have the data from the government in terms of the gender impact on some of the policies. So there is a Kickstart scheme placement that's available, and I've asked the government to give me data on how many men and women that have benefited from it. We need to keep up the pressure on the government to make sure that businesses and self-employed, particularly women, get the support they need. And this is something that we do know, that 80% of the impact of cuts to Social Security during the last decade have fallen on women. So I do understand the urgent support that's needed specifically on that. And so one of the things that we've been looking at in terms of self-employed is the fact that there are issues regarding support for targeted sector the excluded. I've met with the excluded to hear from their concerns. I've met with individuals that work in the sector, such as women, that have talked about their concerns. And I've also met with the Fawcett Society, and I've forgotten, there was the a women's charity that I've highlighted this. So this is something that we are looking into. Is Labour going to support women, and is it an unpaid child benefit? I'm not sure if if I've got the question right. As I've said, I'm not able to comment on this particular policy because it's not really my portfolio, and it wouldn't be appropriate for me to be making announcements on something that's in.
Totally appreciate that. I'm sorry to interrupt now, but we have come to the end of this the session, which I hope you've all enjoyed as much as we did. If you've got any questions, please email women@unison and we'll get back to you by email. Thank you all for attending and for all your input. And thank you to Abena and Gloria for giving up their time to be with us today and sharing their thoughts and experience. Have a good evening all. Good night. Please all stay safe.
Can I just say thank you for your excellent chairing as well?
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
I much appreciate it. Thank you,
Stay
Gloria.
safe as well. You take care. All the best.
Yes,
Thank you.
yes. Thank
everyone.
you. Good night.
Good night. Bye.
Bye.